You ready? Okay, so I've been talking a lot, but my name is Ray Mooney, and I'm the Nature Preserve Manager for the city of Aransas. And we got with Kevin about a year and a half ago to kind of just discuss some needs that we needed in the community, educational voids, things people we felt wanted to learn about. And so we started putting this lecture series together. We've done monthly lectures, and we were partnered with the University of Texas Marine Science Institute, the Mission Aransas National Estuarine Research Reserve, Kevin, AgriLife Extension Agent in Oasis County, and Texas A&M Forest Service has been participating as well. So we're hoping to continue doing this next year, but right now this is our last lecture of the series, and I think it's a really important one for Port Aransas. We have a lot of issues when we get these hard rainfalls, and we have a lot of development occurring. Like, it's just rapidly developing out here, and so people I think would benefit a lot from learning from this lecture. So is that all? Is there anything else, Kevin, or should we just get started? Okay, Kevin's all right. So Charriss, if you want to get started, I'll switch over my view. Thank you so much for coming too.
You're good, Ray. I don't know what I did, but I accidentally couldn't find where I was at. So you're good to go. Thank you.
Okay, can you confirm that you're seeing the correct screen here?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So my name is Charriss York. I work for the A&M AgriLife Extension Service, but my position is a little bit different from someone like Kevin. I'm not a county agent. I'm what's considered a specialist. And so I actually work all up and down the coast and across Texas as needed, talking to folks about surface water quality and stormwater and green infrastructure projects. So my office is in Houston. I live in Galveston County, but I work, technically my boss is in College Station, and I kind of work wherever I am needed. So we work up here with a lot of master naturalists and a lot of master gardeners, just because they're close to us and they're local. So I have some inkling of what some of you guys bring to the table. But today I'm going to talk to you about some green infrastructure practices and what they are and how you might be able to use them. I was only able to see online the last couple lectures that you guys have done in the series, so I don't think you've talked about anything like this before, but it's possible you've hit on some of these topics a little bit earlier in the year. So when we talk about water, on most days, many of us don't think about the water around us, right? We can maybe see it from our house, we see it when we're driving to work, and we kind of take it for granted, right? It's there, it's beautiful. Maybe we're thinking about that redfish we're going to catch later today, but we don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. It's when the water starts looking like this or like this that all of a sudden everyone is very concerned about our water resources. But we need to be thinking about both of these sides of the coin when we are planning our landscapes and especially our citywide and our community type storm drains and infrastructure practices. On the coast, you guys know, we get small rainfalls, we get giant rainfalls, we get gully washers, and they might all happen in the same week, and we never know what we're going to get. And so it's important to think about things like green infrastructure that give us the flexibility to handle large rainfalls, small rainfalls, that we're picking the right kind of plants that can handle some of those dry periods. They can handle the unique soils we have on the coast, all of those types of things. So the program that I run in Houston is called Green Infrastructure for Texas, or GIFT. And we talk about these green infrastructure practices, what we say across the landscape spectrum. Everything from a small or a site scale project that might happen at one home or one business, up to a mid-scale project that maybe serves a community or a neighborhood, up to big practices, 500, 5,000 acres, where we're preserving, restoring, and protecting large pieces of property for their ecosystem services. And so we do this because there is no one size fits all when it comes to a community. I can't just walk in and say, if you do X, Y, and Z, then you're gonna solve all of your problems. It's really looking at each community individually, at their needs, at their resources, and trying to plug in the right practice in the right place. And that's going to look a little bit different. And so we talk about all of these different sides of things to help people expand their thought process, to think about things that might be possible where they live. And so that's one of the things that I want to challenge you to do today is, as we move through this, let me plant some seeds. Let those ideas kind of start to build. And maybe at this exact moment in time, you can't see this thing happening where you live, but give it some time to, as you're driving around and you're looking at different things and you're noticing different things, let these ideas start to populate in your brain and see where they can go. So we're going to talk a little bit about stormwater and stormwater runoff today. We're going to talk a little bit about pollution, because the great thing about these green infrastructure practices is they give us a multitude of benefits, and we get water quality and water quantity. I kind of don't know how to talk about those two things separately, so we're going to talk about both of them a little bit today. And then we'll get into specifically green stormwater infrastructure, which are those site scale projects. And I'm going to spend most of the time talking about those today, and what those solutions are and why we might want to use some of them. So we're going to start very basic. These first couple of slides are just to bring us up all to the same baseline knowledge, to make sure that we're using the same terms today. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I found that it's worth spending a few minutes just so I make sure that we're all using the same words the same way. So when we look at our local hydrologic cycle, whenever it rains, the first thing that happens is those plants that are there, whether they're trees or there are coastal prairie grasses, they're going to intercept some of that rain as it comes down. Some of it, and they're going to use some of that, they're going to evapotranspirate it right back up into the air. Some of that water is never even going to make it to the ground. Even in a natural ecosystem, some is going to make it to the ground. That's going to either soak into the soil along those plant roots or those air pockets in the soil. But some of it is going to, especially on a very intense rainfall, that's going to flow across the ground, and that's what we call the surface water runoff. Once the water gets into the soil, it does move laterally. Sometimes it goes all the way down into the aquifer, but it can also move laterally within the soil. And you'll notice in this image, a lot of the arrows are close to the same size, that kind of all of these things are happening in relative balance. But when we come in and we start building our communities, and we're putting in homes and schools and churches and grocery stores and all the things we need to do our life, we change what this hydrologic cycle looks like. Now, when it rains, there's not as much vegetation to intercept that rain as it's coming down. Also, once a piece of land is built out, it's a lot harder for the water to soak into the soil. Just the act of construction, driving tractors and trucks and things across the land starts to reduce the air pockets in the soil so that there's less water that can soak in. The soil, even in our yards, is less able to hold water than like a native prairie ecosystem. So you'll see in this second image that our surface water runoff arrow is a lot larger. The water that does soak in, it's still going to go down to the aquifer or move around laterally within the soil. But this water that's running across whenever it rains, that's what we're going to call surface runoff or stormwater runoff. Okay, so we've made it through our first bullet point. Now we're going to spend a couple of minutes talking about the quality of that surface water runoff and how pollution can get in there. So the most common ones that we see here in Texas are pathogens or bacteria. And so that's things like you might hear people talk about fecal coliform bacteria or E. coli. Nutrients, so that's things like nitrogen and phosphorus, which are good in small amounts, but when there's too much of them can become problematic. Sediments, so things like soil that's in the water column, so erosion from stream banks or from construction sites, and that soil that gets in there and it creates the muddy water so that the light can't penetrate down into the water. Or finally, debris, straight up trash that's in our waters. So in Texas, there's two entities, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality and the Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board, who are tasked with keeping tabs on the water quality of our surface waters in Texas. This map is from the TCEQ's Surface Water Quality Viewer. And right now we're simply looking at a map of the water bodies in Texas. And so it shows you kind of what you would expect. There's more water in East Texas and not so much in West Texas. But this is a GIS-based map. And when you go onto the viewer, you can turn on and off all kinds of different layers. So I'm going to change the view a little bit. Now what we're looking at, in this case, if it's red, it's still a body of water, but now it is showing those segments that do not meet their designated use by the state of Texas. So they are considered impaired, which you could think of them as being polluted. So in Texas, more than 50% of the impaired water bodies have high levels of fecal coliform bacteria in them. The second most common type of impairment that we see is dissolved oxygen. So in this case, dissolved oxygen isn't actually the impairment, but we see low levels of dissolved oxygen, which becomes problematic if you are a fish or some sort of wildlife that's trying to inhabit that stream. There's a few other things that we see here and there, but those are the two primary types of impairments that we see in Texas. The other thing that you might note is, I told you guys I'm from the Houston area. So if you look down here, the more people that are around, typically the worse the water quality is what we see. That is not always true. You can see Austin's doing a little bit better up here. But there seems to be a connection between people and water quality. So where does this pollution come from? And I will say it is a cumulative result of our everyday actions. Now, I'm not saying that any of you woke up this morning and said, today I'm going to make some water pollution. I mean, maybe you did, but I don't think that's how it usually happens. What happens is we make thousands of decisions every day in our life, and the little decisions start to add up to be to big ones. And so some of the sources of pollution, I told you we had bacteria. So fecal coliform bacteria, I'm sure you can tell from the name fecal, it comes from the gastrointestinal tract of warm-blooded mammals. So it's inside of me, it's inside of you, it's inside of cute little dogs and tasty cattle, nefarious feral hogs. All of these are sources of potential sources of bacteria. These three particular types of animals don't use the toilet. They're going outside, and wherever they leave their waste, it can potentially wash into our waterways. When we're talking about human waste, it's typically malfunctioning septic systems, or even it could be a municipal system where perhaps there's cracks in the pipes, or there's lift stations that are working properly and the waste isn't making it where it's supposed to. Nitrogen and phosphorus, in this case, most of that comes from us and our decisions that we're making on our homes and on our lawns. On a per acre basis, homeowners use more chemical fertilizers and pesticides than agriculture does. You have to remember, most of these producers have a bottom line. They're a business, and they're taking care of that resource so that for years to come, they can continue to farm. And also they're trying to make some money. Whereas for homeowners, it's a lot easier to run down to the big box store on the corner and buy a bag of stuff and put it on the yard. And I would suggest that it's very important to read those package instructions and make sure that you're following those correctly. I'd also suggest that you send a soil test off to the lab in College Station for $6. They'll tell you what's in that soil and what, if anything, you might need to add to your lawn. Maybe save you a few bucks down the road. Again, the sediments. So these are things like it might be erosion from a stream bank or runoff from a construction site that's not properly fenced for silt and things. And then finally, trash and debris. And this is the one that I really don't understand, because trash cans aren't that hard, guys. We can do this. So hopefully this gives you an idea of what I mean when I say it's a cumulative result of our everyday actions. It's little things that are happening here and there that if one person's doing them really isn't a problem. But when we start to have this person A plus person B plus person C, now we start to see a bigger issue. Things like point source pollution, maybe it's from a plant or a pipe. Those things in Texas are almost entirely permitted, and there's a mechanism in place where they can be held accountable for their actions. You can have whatever opinions you want about if they're held accountable in the correct way, but those permits give us a mechanism for enforcement. With non-point source pollution or stormwater runoff pollution, there's not really a mechanism the same way. So how does that pollution make it from our homes to our streams and our bays and to the Gulf? Well, if you don't live where you could look out and see the water, sometimes that connection gets a little bit lost, and it's actually more direct than you might think. The waters go straight from our lawns to our driveways and our roads, down through our storm drains and our ditches and our culverts, and right into the streams. You'd be surprised how many people in the general public think that there is some type of treatment plant in this line of, in this path, but there really is not. Whatever happens here is going to make it directly into the local water body. Okay, so we've covered some basic background information. Hopefully we're all kind of up to speed here on what that means. And moving forward, we can talk more about the green stormwater infrastructure. So what I mean when I say green stormwater infrastructure is an approach to land development or redevelopment, because these practices can very easily be retrofit, where we're working with nature and we're holding water as close to its source as possible. This goes by a lot of different names. You might have heard it called low impact development, which is also called LID or LID. Blue-green infrastructure is a term that I'm hearing a lot. You'll hear me call it green stormwater infrastructure. That is the term that's preferred by the EPA and some of the federal agencies, but people also call them BMPs or best management practices or stormwater retrofits. And that's part of the problem with these practices, is that we don't have a standardized nomenclature. And so sometimes we're all talking about the same thing, but we don't even realize it. But at the end of the day, we're looking to work with nature to detain water close to where it falls instead of just shipping it down the pipe as soon as we can. Okay, so we're going to look at a pseudo graph here. It's not a real graph. But this picture in the back is a native prairie ecosystem, a coastal prairie. This one happens to be a restored prairie at Ormond Bayou Nature Center, but we have coastal prairies up and down the Texas coast. Our x-axis is in time and our y-axis is flow rate. So we're going to look at the water moving across the land, especially when it rains. So when it first starts to rain, most of the water is going to soak in. It's going to go down the roots of the plants and into the soil. As the intensity of the storm picks up, even in these natural systems, like we talked about before, we're going to see runoff. And then as the storm continues, we will see less and less runoff as the intensity decreases again. But overall, it's a fairly flat, this line we call a hydrograph, hydro meaning water, graph meaning line. So we're just looking at a picture of what happens to the water over time. Well, what happens when we change that system? Now we're looking at a big box store of some sort. So instead of having all of that open soil for the water to soak into, now we have a impervious roof, we have an impervious parking lot, we have one little tree here and a little bit of grass where maybe some water can soak into, but looks a little bit different. Well, what happens to it now when it rains? Well, almost as soon as it starts raining, we're going to start seeing that runoff. The water can't soak into the roof, it can't soak into the ground, and it's going to start running off almost immediately. You'll also see that our peak is a lot higher here. So we see more runoff and it's arriving faster. So the idea is to use these nature-based solutions to take this red line on our developed properties and try to get it to mimic this black line of nature. Now, I'm a biologist and I'm a realist, and I don't think we're ever going to get this red line to match this black line, but I think anything that we can do to pull that hydrograph down on the developed area and to get it closer to that black line is going to help us in the long run. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to use these green stormwater infrastructure practices to slow the water down, to spread the water out, and to soak it into the ground. Those three things will really help us reduce the amount of water that's going downstream. And then we will get all of the great water quality benefits from these practices, as well as some of the flood detention benefits. So you'll hear me say these words over and over as we move through the rest of the presentation. That water, we want to take it, we want to slow it down, spread it out, and soak it in. So we're going to go back to this image for just a minute and that path of the water flowing. And in this case, we've changed the picture a little bit. Instead of the water going straight from the lawn into the streets, now we can send it into a green stormwater practice. So in this case, it's a rain garden. And so we're effectively inserting a treatment plant in here. When the water soaks into the soil, we can use the benefits of those naturally occurring microbes that can break down that can kill the bacteria, can break down hydrocarbons, can use those nitrogen and phosphorus and can fix those in different ways. And so not only are we holding the water for short periods of time, we are also then sending cleaner water downstream when we do send it. So the practices that we're going to talk about specifically also give you a multitude of benefits. So we're not just looking at water quality, we're not just looking at flood control, we're looking at all kinds of things. When you start using native plants, you start creating habitat, depending on where you are and the size of the practice that you're using. We're probably talking about habitat for things like songbirds and butterflies and hummingbirds. But when you get into the large scale practices, who knows who you might encourage to come and live there. Also, the simple beauty, this picture on the top left is at a library in Galveston County. When we're talking about these as ways to reduce stormwater infrastructure, you know, a rain garden is a lot prettier than a big concrete culvert. And it's what you want outside of your library window, or maybe you don't want a big pipe sitting out there. And then I'll mention this because you said we might have some city folks around. If you have an MS4 permit requirement, so MS4 is Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System permit. If you don't know what that is, don't worry about it. If you do know what it is, the last round of permitting, there was 2 of the minimum control measures that dealt directly with these practices that we're talking about today. So it can help you meet those required permit needs. Okay, so now we have an overview of what green stormwater infrastructure does. So what is it specifically? The first practice we're going to talk about are rain gardens, sometimes called bioretention cells. And you guys already saw a picture of one of these rain gardens. So in this case, the idea is to use a garden to actually hold the water. So a lot of times when we're building gardens, we build raised beds and we build up. Well, a rain garden takes that idea and flips it on its head. Instead of building up, we're building down. So you're actually creating a shallow bowl-shaped depression. We use native plants and adapted plants because these plants are going to have to withstand a wet dry cycle, and we need plants that can handle that. Typically, we plant plants 10 times. The vegetation that likes water in the middle, and then drier loving plants towards the sides. This diagram that we have here on the slide is what we consider to be a commercial style rain garden. So this might be taking water from a parking lot or a rooftop from a business. And so in this case, we've actually dug down 3 feet and put in an under drain pipe. And this is a perforated pipe that connects into the storm drain system. So a rain garden should hold water for about 24 hours. You're trying to hold the water for a short period of time. The water will filter through the soil where all of that great cleaning can happen. Then it'll move into this under drain pipe and then into the storm drain system. So in this picture in the left, there is this is at a park in League City, Texas. There's a parking lot here that is draining. You can see the curb cut. And so it's actually graded for the water to flow into the garden, to soak down, and then into that under drain pipe that we talked about. And you can see things like the Texas Star Hibiscus here in the back. These are a smaller practice. So this is one parking lot. And like I said before, it would hold the water for about 24 hours. Most of these gardens are what we would consider designed for a 90th percentile storm. So if you think about percentiles, like with a growth chart or with a grade on a test, 90th percentile means you're doing, 90th percentile on a test is you did better than 90% of the people. So in this case, a 90th percentile storm means we're holding about 90% of the rainfalls that we get. So these are the smaller rainfalls. Maybe it's holding a ½ inch to an inch of rain. It's not going to be able to protect a home or a business from a 5-inch rainfall. But there are benefits to that. If we're holding some of these smaller rainstorms on site, then it leaves more space available in our detention ponds and our storm drain systems down the road. So if we're holding some of it, it opens up space down the line for other capacity. Here's a couple other examples. The picture in the top left is from Dallas. It's in an area called Deep Ellum. So there was a whole street that was flooding regularly. They were going to have to tear up the street and replace all of the storm pipes and put in larger storm sewers. Instead of that, they tried this green infrastructure, these green stormwater practices, and up and down the street, they put a series of these rain gardens. So they took out a couple of parking stalls, but you can see again, we have the curb cuts here, so the water is flowing in. They ended up not pulling up the street, not replacing any of the existing pipes, but instead they're holding the water for short periods of time in these rain gardens, and they save themselves a whole lot of money. And you can, this picture is actually from a Google map. You can do a Google Street View, and you can see all of the gardens up and down. And I show you this picture, and there's also this picture in the bottom right, because I want you to really look at the plants that are in these rain gardens. Especially in the bottom right, you'll see there's trees growing next to the street, but both of these in the rain gardens, we have very low growing plants because we're putting them next to streets. And if we start planting big bushes, what's going to happen? We're going to lose our visibility and we're going to lose our sight lines, and you're not going to be able to see. And even though you might be helping your flooding situation, or you might be improving water quality, now you're causing car wrecks, and we don't want to do that. So it's important to think about where you're putting these things in every little aspect of the design so that you're going to have a successful project. So that first design that I told you about, I called it a commercial style. If you're building something at a home, this happens to be at Armand Bayou Nature Center, you don't always have to go that extreme to dig down 3 feet and connect to the storm drain pipes. If you're collecting water off maybe just a driveway, or you have a spot in your backyard where you want to hold some water off your roof, or collecting sheet flow, we can do a much simpler design. So in this case, you want it to be about 1 foot deep, but that still doesn't mean you have to dig down 1 foot. If you dig down 6 inches and you take that soil and you use it to create a berm that's 6 inches high, now you have about 12 inches of depth, but you've only done about half that amount of work. When you're designing a rain garden, you want to keep it at least 10 feet from any structure so that we don't accidentally flood that structure or impede the existing, I forgot the word. I can't think of it. We don't want to mess with the foundation. That's the word. We don't want to mess with the foundation by inundating it with water, drying it out, that sort of thing. So in this case, we're really just taking that soil and maybe amending it with some compost if we need to make sure there's good habitat for the plants. We're putting in those plants, they're going to use that water, they're going to evapotranspirate it out. Sometimes these gardens will hold the water a little bit longer than 24 hours, depending on what kind of soil we're putting them in. If it's a really sandy soil, it'll run through pretty fast. If there's a lot of clay, it might take a little bit more time. But if you have the right plants in there, then they're going to be using that water and it's going to move through. But there's no need for an under drain pipe or any of that extra gravel. Okay, so those are rain gardens. We're going to move into swales. These are just open drainage courses with gently sloping sides. Most of the time, everyone looks at me and says, Charriss, you're talking about ditches. And the answer is yes, I am. But the thing about these is you want to make sure that they're shallow so that they're easily mowed. Where I live, the county always comes in and they come in and they scoop out the ditches and they make them deeper and deeper. And then the ditches get deeper than the culverts so that the water doesn't actually flow anymore. That is something we want to avoid. We want to make sure that the water is moving. But studies have shown that we get a smaller mosquito population with open ditches than we do with enclosed pipes. Because when the swale is open, we're directing the water where we want it to go. The plants are slowing it down a little bit. So any of the pollutants, the sediments and things can start to drop out of suspension. We also have the opportunity for the plants to use that water or for it to evaporate back out into the air. So these are some examples around homes. We can also use them along streets and around roads. The bottom right-hand corner, I want to point out because it's a little bit hard to see, which I think is good because it shows how well it blends in, but also you can mow that very easily. Just using regular turf grass, you can come in with your regular mowers. We're not going to really be changing the maintenance regime of that area, but we're still directing the water around. It has enough of a depression that we're holding the water a little bit and moving it downstream. The picture in the upper left, that's a very fancy swale, I would say. This one is very garden-esque. It almost looks like a rain garden with some of the plants, but it just shows you, depending on where you putting it, installing it and what you want it to look like, you can go very simple or very ornate and get some of the same benefits because we're just trying to slow that water down and again, give it a chance to soak into the ground. So rainwater harvesting, this is one of the ones that's the easiest to kind of start at home with something as small as a rain barrel and then move into some of these larger tanks. So this in the left is actually at a Master Gardener Pavilion in Victoria, Texas. This is in Galveston County and this is in College Station. So in this case, we're collecting water off of a rooftop. So here's an impervious surface where that water would typically be running off. And what I told you, we're going to slow it down, spread it out and soak it in. So we slow it down in one of these tanks. But once you get it in the tank, you have to use it for something. If you don't use the water, you miss the spread it out and soak it in. The most common use for this type of water is for landscape irrigation. You can run these into a drip irrigation system without too much issue, and you can water your landscaping. But there are other uses as well. If you put a small caliber pump in there and you can pressurize the tank so the water will come out of the hose, you can use it to wash cars, fleet vehicles. I've seen examples where they're at fire stations and they use that water to wash the fire trucks. So these two pictures are some fairly large tanks. This one on the right, you might be saying, Charriss, where's the tank in there? So this gentleman is actually pointing to the tank. It's a very low profile tank. It's only about 12 inches wide and it's very long and it's about 5 feet tall. I think it holds about 600 or 700 gallons. But you can see how easy these things are to disguise if you don't want to be seen. If there's a spot where you want a rainwater tank, you can probably find one that will fit there. This one on the left is plastic. This one in the middle is metal. And this one that he's pointing to is also plastic hidden behind those wooden fences. Depending on where you live, it is possible to do below ground rainwater harvesting as well. You can see in this picture on the right, there's some gentlemen standing here to give you a sense of scale. In Webster, Texas, which is in southern Harris County, there's a building where they collect their stormwater underground. It's actually LEED certified. And they have a second set of pipes in the building and they use it kind of like gray water. There's a UV light system that they use to treat the water, but then they use it to flush their toilets. Where I live in Galveston County, our water table is much too high. We'd never be able to actually hold water underground because we're already holding it underground all the time. But I wanted to mention this because, you know, it doesn't work where I live, but 15 minutes up the road it does. So depending on how close you are to the coast, this may or may not be a good example for you. So pervious pavement. So in this case, we're looking at pavement or pavers where the water actually percolates through. So instead of having an impervious surface, we're turning that into a pervious surface. There's a ton of different products that do this. There's pervious asphalt, pervious concrete, pervious pavers that we'll see in the next picture. And you can pair the pavement with the underground water tanks if you want to, and drain the water right into a tank and then use it for something else. So here's some examples of the pavers. The one on the left is used for a sidewalk. The one on the right, they're using the pavers as the parking stalls. In that particular instance, the main drive lane is still a traditional type of asphalt or concrete, but they've used the pavers in the parking stalls. They could have used the pervious system across the whole street, and I don't know why they didn't. But I will tell you that I like to use this example because sometimes we get so caught up in what we want that we're not willing to compromise. And I like to think that this was a compromise. that for some reason they couldn't get them to agree to do the whole area, or maybe the budget didn't allow them to do the whole area. So they got creative and they stuck with the traditional concrete in the middle, but they got these pervious paved parking stalls. So in this case, the water's flowing through the parking areas. And so something is better than nothing is what I would say, especially if you're in a community that doesn't have a lot of this green stormwater infrastructure already, and there's naysayers. Getting started with one project is really the best way to get people to come around. And kind of sometimes we need to make some concessions to get that first project going, but don't think of it as losing. Think of it as a partial win that leads to the next project and the next project and the next project, so that we can win over folks as we go along. I almost took this slide out, but I decided to leave it in. Green roofs. So in this case, we're actually taking a roof and putting a garden on top of it. Most homeowners and most business owners are not going to be able to go for this practice. And it's really hard to retrofit because you have to make sure that you have the load capacity on your roof to hold not only the soil and the plants, but also the water that soil is going to hold as well. It creates a lot of extra weight on the roof. But I went ahead and left it in here because I said today was about planting seeds, about giving ideas. And so I thought, well, why not? Let's put this idea out there and see what you guys think. So I kind of explained it already, but the key parts here are making sure that you have a waterproofing layer, then you have the soil layer, and the plants, and you want to make sure that you have plants that are low growing or low maintenance, because the last thing you want to be doing is hauling a lawnmower onto your roof to mow your plants. But the picture on the left is in Webster, Texas. That's that same building that has the underground stormwater system, also has this green roof on top. And even though they have a picnic table, they don't actually allow people to go out there because there's not a railing along the edges, but you can see that they have very low growing plants that are pretty low maintenance. There's also a gentleman at Texas A&M, Bruce Dvorak, who's done a lot of research into what type of plants that you'd want to put on your roof. And so if you're looking for examples of what type of plants to use, you should look into his work. This is again in League City. Now on the right, if you guys are at all familiar with Houston and you've been downtown, you can see the George R. Brown here in the background. So you can see that we're in downtown Houston. So those are green roofs. Basically, you're taking a impervious surface and turning it into a garden. So I use the term water smart landscapes, but you might use conservation landscapes or all kinds of different words. But the idea of using native plants, less chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and really working with nature in our landscapes. This, again, is a very easy way to get started. Using compost to build healthy soil, because healthy soil holds more water, and it also gives you healthier plants and creates habitat. Thinking about using less turf grass and turning what might be a grassy area into your lawn or business into a more native habitat. So on the left is Armand Bayou Nature Center. At the right, this is part of the University of Houston Clear Lake, their environmental education system, where they've turned all of their turf grass into a native prairie ecosystem. And then on the right is a park in Lake City. So even though these are more traditional type flower beds, they're still all maintained organically and with compost and a mix of native plants that require less water and less maintenance over time. And so I think the last one I'm going to share with you guys today are vegetated buffers. And this is another one that I almost didn't show you, but I decided to go ahead and put in. So the buffer is just the edge of the property. And so a lot of times it's easy to imagine the buffer on the edge of like a stream or on the edge of an agricultural field, this area on the side where we're not actively using for production, but we're leaving those native plants because they're trying to slow the water down, spread it out and soak it in. When the water is running off the field and it's going to hit this vegetation, it's going to slow it down. It's going to give some of it a chance to soak in. Again, pollutants are going to start to fall out of suspension. And some of it's still going to move in there, but it's going to be a little bit cleaner. The same thing can be done on the edge of other types of properties as well, even if you're in more of a suburban area. So on the left is an example where we're using wildflowers at a park as a buffer so that the water before it drains off, we're slowing it down with these plants and we're giving it a chance to soak into the soil. Vegetative buffers, a lot of times we think about in a much larger scale. So in this case, we're looking at Dickinson Bayou. On the north side of the bayou, you can see that there are mowed turf grass lawns that go right up to the edge of the water. And this whole area is bulkheaded here. So the water is flowing straight in. On this bottom side, you can see we have more of the native. You can start to see all the trees that are there, some of these trees and this native vegetation where the water is slowing down and having that chance to soak in and get a little bit cleaner before it makes it into the bayou. So you can think about vegetative buffers from a small scale on individual property all the way up to a large scale kind of throughout this whole watershed. So if you're thinking, okay, well, here's these ideas and how do I know what to put where? That's what we're trying to show you in this picture. So if you look at the top here, we start on the left, and these are kind of planning terms, but basically it's the more rural on the left. And as we move to the right, we kind of get into suburban and neighborhood centers and up into more urban areas. So more people, more homes, more businesses, more concrete. And as we move down, each individual line is a different type of practice. So rainwater harvesting, that's one that we talked about. The darker the color green, the more appropriate that practice is for that area. And then lighter green into white, and white is where we would say it's probably going to be the least successful and probably wouldn't recommend. So things like pervious pavement, rain gardens and swales, good when you have some homes and businesses, but not so great in the rural areas. You wouldn't want to go in and tear up a beautiful natural existing landscape just to put in a rain garden. We'd want to leave that alone and let Mother Nature keep doing her thing, because Mother Nature is going to do it better than we can. So this is just to give you an idea. I didn't talk about these bottom three, which are some of the larger types of practices. But I can point you in the direction of resources if you're interested in larger practices like constructed stormwater wetlands, conservation neighborhoods, or again, those large scale conservation, preservation and restoration type projects. And the reason you might consider some of those is because the larger projects give you more ecosystem services. The larger your project is, the more water it can hold, the more homes it can protect, the more habitat you're creating. Okay, so we have made it through our entire agenda. We talked about what stormwater is, how it can be polluted. We've talked about what green stormwater infrastructure is and some of the other names that it goes by. And then we talked about some of the specific projects, things like rain gardens, rainwater harvesting, pervious pavement, or swales. So I'm going to leave you with one last thought, which is what we do on the land, we read in the water. So I'm going to take you back to that cumulative results of our everyday actions and those individual decisions that we're making. If we can improve our decisions, we can improve our water. So thank you.
That was really great. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question, Ray. So Charriss, these practices are, you can apply them to just about anywhere, right?
Yes.
Do we see these being applied more in a city location, or can somebody that lives out in the country also put them into action?
Yeah, it really depends on the practice. I have seen a lot of folks in rural areas, especially with the rainwater harvesting, because that can be used for a lot of different purposes. I've actually seen rainwater harvesting situations where it's used to create, to water livestock or create kind of habitat oases for wildlife and things like that. And the same with the pervious pavement that a lot of what we do in rural areas can can use those pervious pavement and have that soak in, or the same with the swales. Some of those are ones that are very easy to incorporate into rural areas.
Very cool. Great presentation. Can you hang around for a minute
I can.
after we
And
stop?
yeah, I will also, when we get done here, I will send Ray a PDF copy of my slides that you're welcome to share with the group if they're interested.
That's why I didn't mention this before we started, but the city of Port Aransas, we worked on a coastal management program grant last year for stormwater management as well. So we have sort of little plan in place, well, of suggested BMPs and things that will be beneficial for us to do here, large scale infrastructure projects down to what, individual homeowners can do. And so we've been trying to get some funding together for city properties to, like you said, we want to get a demonstration project. And so we are, I think, hopefully next year going to be getting some funding where we're going to put in a rain garden and resurface one of our parking lots.
Fantastic.
So it's a small parking lot at the birding center. But people have been very critical of the materials that are used. And so I'd be interested in knowing exactly I did write down one of the pervious pavements that you referenced up there, but people are scared of new products, or there was one product where they were worried if we put it at the Civic Center, women wear high heels and they get stuck in it and things like that. So specifically, we've heard a lot of worries about the sand clogging up the pervious pavement and stuff. So I'm glad you're coastal and maybe you have some good product examples that you can share with us.
Yeah, we have some different folks that we can connect you with. And I've also, traveling around, there's an example. It's not a City of Brownsville project, but it's in Brownsville where they did have the sand clog up their pavers. And some of that is it just needs maintained better. I will tell you that they are making improvements on especially the pervious pavers, and that every year they get a little bit better how they're doing that. And there's even things like grass pave where you're putting in an extra support system. Most of the time it's a plastic grid, and then you actually grow the grass on top of it.
Oh.
So it looks very nice. It's very easy to walk on and to drive on, but you have that underground support, so you're not going to sink and create ruts, and the water can still soak through it. So it sounds like maybe that would be an option that would help some of the ideas that you have.
I think that product too. So with all the short-term rentals in Port Aransas, the city, because of the parking problems and all these issues, decided a while ago, council decided that we needed a parking space per bedroom. So then the short-term rentals decided they were going to concrete the whole front yard. So one thing we've discussed is, like what you're saying, maybe your extra parking would be like a grass area or something that has to be pervious, so that the entire front yard of all these homes isn't concrete.
Yes. Yeah, isn't it funny how we try to solve one problem and we accidentally create another one?
Yeah. And then people know, then they say, oh, well, this is so maintenance free. I love it. And then we're like, no. So
Right.
yeah.
You'd think they'd be happy that we were giving them a reason not to wear high heels.
Well, yeah. Well, that's why I'm like, really? How many women are wearing stilettos to the Port Aransas Civic Center? There's something to be said about everything. So. And then I think another thing that misconception, I think, is that when people see pavers, they're not all pervious, right?
No, they are not. In fact, we have an installation. It was created specifically so we could do some testing of the site. And so we have two smaller parking areas right beside each other. One is pervious and one is not. And if you didn't know the difference, you would not be able to tell them apart. But most of the pervious pavers, it is not the paver itself that the water actually flows through. It's the spaces between, and the pavers are created with bumps on the sides so that they are forcing space between the two. And then instead of putting sand between them like you would a typical paver, you use a larger aggregate. So there's a stone between them instead. So there's more space for the water to flow through. And depending on what you're putting them on top of, if you're putting them on top of like clay, then we actually suggest you use a rock base underneath. So then you're creating actually more space underneath for the water to flow. And then some of that pervious pipe again into the storm drains. Or even sometimes if you're putting on something like sand, it's good to do that rock base underneath so that you get less shifting and moving of the pavers over time. It helps create a more stable base. So even if the water can flow through the sand pretty well, it helps them stay level for longer. So one thing I should point you guys towards is, and I'll see if I can drop a link in the chat, is my group is part of the Clean Coast Texas Collaborative, who Ray, I think you probably have been talking to, but there is a sustainable stormwater manual for this Texas coast. Whew, I think I got that right. And if I can find the right link real quick, I will drop it. I think this is it, into the link into the chat. That's what I'm trying to say. That's not it. I don't know why I just stuck that in there. Okay. Sorry. There we go. There we go. That is the link to the guidance for sustainable stormwater drainage on the Texas coast. So if you're looking for specifics on things like pervious pavement or the specs, that type of thing, a lot of that is contained in this manual and can point you in the right direction. And it's really good because a lot of times you're probably going to end, when you're doing something like pervious pavement, you're going to end up working with an engineer, but this gives you some knowledge going into that so that you're not entirely relying on them, that you're able to walk in and ask some specific questions and kind of gauge who you're working with. So
yeah, because it's, that's not something these small towns on the coast, the engineers are dealing with lots of big problems and they're not necessarily thinking outside the box all the time. So it's good to have those resources for them. I think that's probably why this document was created. We don't have that much staff in these small cities. So.
Yes. I'm going to drop, if I do it right, one more link in the chat. So this is the website for my program. And we have a projects tab in there where it will show you some of the projects we've done. Most of these on the ground projects are in the Houston-Galveston area because that's where we're located and it's a lot easier for us to manage projects close to where we live. But it's a lot of pictures and ideas of different things that have been done and might give you some examples of how this could be done right there where you guys are.
Charriss, do you have any handouts that would be suitable to give to the general public about alternatives to surfaces such as concrete and asphalt?
I do not. I'm trying to think. I don't think we have any fact sheets about that.
Just thinking it would be really cool to be able to have something on hand that we could pass out to the general public, giving them some alternatives such as rain gardens or even just a small patch of short plants that would absorb some of the runoff instead of it running into the storm drain.
That's something, anything like that would be great for us to have in our building department. Everyone's coming in for a building permit and some of these things aren't going to make it cost more. So they can, maybe if they
Anyway, I would work with you. I would work with you if you wanted to work on a handout.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I dropped another link. We have some other fact sheets about rain gardens. They are not, some of them are more detailed than others. And things like the resource guide is really directed to the Houston, Galveston area. But I'm writing some notes here, Kevin.
I'm making you work, aren't I?
That's okay. That's how this is supposed to work, right? We talk to each other and we come up with new ideas and we make things happen. So
I'm thinking even stuff that I could to home builders and
That'd be great.
new construction.
Someone else
Yeah.
have a question? Heard someone talking.
Yes, sorry, this is Alyssa. I'm with the City of Bay City, and I know you said you weren't gonna elaborate or share on it, but I was just wondering about the large scale, like stormwater regional detention pond type things. That's been brought up in our area before, and I honestly wouldn't even know how to start talking about a project like that, but it's very interesting, like concept to me. And I was just wondering if you have any information. I know this wasn't about this, but you had mentioned it in the last slide. And
Yes.
just kind of caught my attention more.
So I'm looking right now. What I will do is I will send Ray a case study we have of a project that's called Exploration Green. It's in Clear Lake, Texas. It's about a 400-acre project. It might not be exactly what you're looking for because it is in a suburban area, but the area was developed without detention requirements. And so a lot of homes and businesses were experiencing flooding. And so they came back in, and it's actually an old golf course that they're retrofitting into stormwater detention. And so it's 400 acres. And it's a really interesting project. So it's regional detention. And when it's done, there's 5 phases. 4 are constructed right now. They're working on phase 5 starting next year. And when it's all said and done, about 16,000 homes and businesses will be protected from flooding. And that
Very
particular
interesting,
one, phase 1 was about 80% completed when Hurricane Harvey blew through. And while you guys got the wind, we got the rain. So this is an area where they had 40+ inches of rainfall. And with phase 1 partially completed, there was about 150 homes that were flooding in smaller rainfalls that did not flood during Hurricane Harvey. And so the community was so impressed by how it was working, they asked if they could build it faster. And so it went from a 15-year construction timeline to a 7-year construction timeline.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
So that's a success story that we like to talk about. It has walking trails and all kinds of, it's basically turned into a 400-acre park that floods when it rains. So we have a case study about that written up that I will send to Ray that she can share.
Thank you. It sounds great.
I have a lot of questions, so I'll ask one more. No one else has one right now. So about 2 years ago, the city, we amended our landscape ordinance because it was very difficult to read and follow and enforce and all that stuff. So we made it more simple with the goal mainly of beautifying properties, especially along the corridor when people come into Port Aransas. But we just kept coming up over and over again about adding a green infrastructure component, about pervious cover and all that. Are you aware of any? I think Galveston maybe did they amend the landscape ordinance to have kind of some green infrastructure elements to it, or do you have any other examples that you're aware of?
So I know the city of Houston has a green, they call it a stormwater tax. It's actually a fee that everyone has to pay, but if you have green infrastructure, it reduces your fee. But it's not part of their landscape ordinance.
Okay.
I don't remember Galveston having one, but that doesn't mean they don't.
But
I'll look into that a little bit more.
I know the horticulturist at Galveston, if you want me to ask him.
I mean, any info, well, we were kind of on a roll with all this because we had our stormwater project and then we were hiring an assistant city manager that's going to do our comprehensive master plan, but we did not, or I don't know, he backed out or something. So we're still searching for an assistant city manager to do it. So, but you know, in the meantime, we're all still working on just all the things that we think will be helpful.
I know one of the things that a lot of landscape ordinance or cities have in their landscape ordinance are things like street trees and you know, edging bushes and things that seem like a really great idea, but sometimes those can prevent rain gardens, because if you're concerned about how many trees you have and where specifically they're placed, those are probably placed in the same place that you're putting a rain garden. And so sometimes we have run into issues with that, trying to help folks put in rain gardens where they're actually breaking landscape ordinances and have to go in and get variances and things like that. So that's something to think about.
I've also experienced a lot of home HOAs, a lot of homeowner associations that have really crazy requirements for the area between the street and the sidewalk.
Yes. And some of the HOAs around here even have like plant lists, required plant lists. You have to plant the things that are on their list. Depends on what, I guess, look they're going for in the community.
I know my daughter and them were in an HOA and they had a relatively small green strip between the sidewalk and the street. And they were required to plant trees that grew pretty large in that strip. And I was like, this is not going to turn out really well.
Yes, there's oftentimes a disconnect in what people ask for and what reality is. Yeah, we'll plant your tree, but in 10 years, you're going to have to replace your sidewalk because tree roots are going to destroy it. So yeah, good times.
More on the lawless side of things. The HOAs are too strict in Port A. People like to do their thing. So it's good.
Yeah.
Any other questions out there? I guess not. Okay, well, thank you so much. That was really good. I learned a lot. I have a lot of ideas. Hope everyone else enjoyed it. We'll be in touch. Or I guess Kevin wants you to stick on for a second.
Yeah, for just a second, please.
Okay.
And you also, Ray.
Okay, yeah. Thank you all for joining us and enjoy your weekend and look out for the next potential series for next year. Okay.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Happy holidays.
Happy
Thank
holidays.
you.